All right, let's move on to Notre Dame, Ohio State. I'm going to give a little plug, collegefootballnerds.com. We're trying to make this a heaven for college football fans who care about statistics, but have some other stuff there. So we got your normal box scores and schedules and things like that. But we are introducing our model that we've had on this show for years. After next week's results, we are turning the model over to you. You can pick any two teams you want in real time, and it'll spit out the same simulation that we use on the show. Got a pick 'em going on right now, $500 prize for October if you're first hearing about this, or for September if you're first hearing about this. You're probably not going to win that one, but we turn that over in October. Also, next week is the first week of Nerd Nation Top 25, so we're going to let you do your own Top 25. One final note of functionality on the website NFLU. So you can go in, put in your favorite school if you're Ohio State fan, Notre Dame fan, and it'll show you in basically real time the entirety of all the former players that played for your team that are now playing in the NFL. It'll show you their stats week by week, overall season, so you can see how they're doing without chasing a bunch of box scores. All right, Josh, that was a long open, but I had to get it out there. Check it out, collegefootballnerds.com. Josh, this game is super interesting to me because in the summer, we had a kind of an opinion of how this maybe line would look, how this game would look. And now I think it's a little different because in my mind, both teams are actually better than I thought they would be, which makes this super hard to pick this game. And then we get a 3-point line coming out of Vegas. Um, this is really tough for me, and I'll tell you why. We feel like these two teams are better, but then when we look at who they've played, it's like I don't necessarily know. So Notre Dame has faced the 83rd, 106th, and 108th, plus Tennessee State, best defenses in the country. So there's no way to know what's going on there. And then I think Indiana's defense is good, but you got 127th best and 66th best offenses that Ohio State has faced in the country. So for me, I think Ohio State fans were really upset after the Indiana score. They wanted 37-3. The 3 to me is what matters more because first start, you're going to have ugly offense. Turns out, because if anybody watched that Louisville game, turns out Indiana's got a good defense. Their offense just sucks. So kind of tee this one up for us. What do you think? Let's start with Ohio State. What do you think about, like, how do you handicap them so far this year based on who they've played? Is it Ohio State of old, or are there some potential scary things hiding behind the surface because they haven't played anybody yet?
There's scariness in the sense that they are not going to be a lead at quarterback at any point this year, which is a relatively new concept under Day. But here's the thing. Go back to that Indiana game. I'm a believer. What was it? 23-3. I'm a believer if they won it 42-21, pretty much the same margin of victory, but the score looked like it did in the past, they'd be fine. The same crowd that has screamed, we've got to get better on defense or we're wasting these good offenses, would be happier with 42-21 than 23-3. And I know that because I have a buddy who fits that description. So I asked him, do you even care about the 3? Like, do you care that you guys were able to pretty much win a game defensively? He said, no, it's just Indiana. It's like, okay, well, you can only play who they put against you. And so now we've moved on a couple of weeks. I think it's undeniable they are the best defensive version of themselves they've been under Ryan Day. And Jim Knowles is now not in his first year, he's in his second year. And so I think they and Texas have a couple of things in common. Both of them have afforded themselves time to become whatever they're going to be offensively because they can actually win games several different ways. These used to be one-trick pony teams. You got to outscore folks or you're not going to win. Now, all of a sudden, they can kind of get it done defensively. They're not going to be known for defense this year. It's Sark and Ryan Day. We get that. But in the meantime, I was watching this quarterback thing play out over fall camp with them. And it was Kyle McCord in spring. It was Kyle McCord in the preview magazines. It was him to open fall camp. And then Devin Brown makes this little charge. And it was, the thing. It's where you log onto the message boards and your team insiders are saying, hey, I know everyone's saying McCord, but Devin Brown, maybe Devin Brown. Well, that was a season. That was a phase because it's McCord's team now, I guess. And the big tell to me about whether Ohio State's offense is is humming the way it needs to this year is not actually going to be that wide receiver production. They should be dominant running the ball. Their personnel, just if you look at recruiting rankings, they should be dominant. And it hasn't necessarily been that. But again, I think that's a team that hasn't hit its offensive stride yet. Now, I had this game circled, dude. Like, this is such a big week, but I had this one circled. So we're going up there Thursday. We'll be there Friday. We're going to be at this game Saturday because I think that if Notre Dame were to beat them, that's Marcus Freeman's moment. And it's a huge indictment. I mean, the Buckeye fan base would handle that every bit as you expect they would handle it. But think about what that does to Notre Dame. You would all of a sudden have FSU, Texas, and Notre Dame thrust into the national title conversation. And those were programs that
feeling like 1993 all over again.
Dude, yeah, 10 minutes ago, people were saying, oh, none of them are ever going to be back again. Like, just, it's crazy what college football does if you just give it a second. So, yeah, I don't even remember which question was, but I do know that was a long-winded way of saying this is going to be really exciting.
So, to me, I think part of what's been lacking in Notre Dame is we've always, it may be a little bit of a backhanded compliment, but we've always focused for the last 5 or 6 years on, maybe 10 years, on the fact that they're really fundamentally sound. Like that is true. And while
they've had a good personality, just say it. They've had a good personality.
While that is true, it is very true. That they're fundamentally sound. Those fundamentals never scared you if you had a team with elite athletes.
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned, and I think it's a great point, because Ohio State, also known for quarterbacks and wide receivers, that offense needs to be able to run at will for that passing game to open up. On the flip side of the ball, or the other side of the ball, you've got Notre Dame, who's got that dude at running back and has proven over a couple of years now. SMA is getting after it. And they're not like at Ohio State, what they're saying is like, we've got this guy who is 5-star everything. We really want him to be the guy. But a lot of crunch time moments and needing to pick up the pace and get out of a rut offensively, it's not that guy, right? It's somebody. They're doing what Alabama's doing with quarterbacks right now, trying to figure it out. Notre Dame's not figuring it out. They've got a quarterback that they haven't had for a decade. They've got what seems to be a fairly dynamic offense, which they haven't really been able to do for a decade, I think, because they haven't had that quarterback. But here's what's interesting to me. So looking at Wake last year, they lost 5 games, right? Hartman threw for 334 per game in those 5 losses. The problem was they gave up 39.8 points in those losses. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people are like, well, Hartman can't beat North Carolina. Hartman can't beat NC State or whatever it was. I don't remember who all they lost to. But it wasn't Hartman. And now, while I don't love this wide receiver room, I love this team a lot more. And I think that gives him an opportunity to really go after it. But does this game, saying all of that, does this game boil down to super experienced, been there, done that starter at quarterback versus a guy who really hasn't played a game of this magnitude ever and is really just getting comfortable in this offense?
I think it may. And you know what? We may not be in love with the Notre Dame receiver core like everyone is with Ohio State, but they got a couple of true freshmen that were huge pickups for them. Both of them have shown varying degrees of flashes so far this year. Everyone always has a breakout game. This could be one of theirs, if not both of theirs. But also, sometimes you try and overthink the room a little bit in trying to pick these games. And it really could be like you just said. It could be as simple as you don't doubt Notre Dame defensively. You don't doubt them fundamentally. You don't doubt anything mechanically about the workings of the program. You doubt whether they can win against elite teams because they lack the ability at quarterback. That's it. And all of a sudden they don't anymore. And also you get to throw in this little nugget of being a home underdog in prime time on NBC. And if you're taking CJ Stroud and marching him in there, that's one thing. You're taking Kyle McCord in there. And frankly, you're taking a team that seems a little unsure of itself offensively in there. And I've watched the last 2 years an Ohio State team that was more sure of itself get undone by Michigan twice. And I don't know that this game doesn't feel a lot the same as those two games have. Different name, obviously, it's not the same rivalry, but this is it's a tough spot for Ryan Day. It is a very blessed and opportunistic spot for Marcus Freeman.
Yeah, and I think that the numbers kind of bear it out too. Like Devin Brown throwing 4 passes in a game where they score 63. Like they're really trying to get Kyle McCord really locked in, which is probably what Alabama should have been doing Saturday. But to me, I love that he was able to go out there last couple of games and put up some numbers, because that is a confidence building thing. I don't love that the coaching staff felt like they needed to.
Yeah, it makes sense. But there's an ideal world and then there's the real world. And Ohio State's living in that real world right now. I still think that that defense has the capability of giving them some runway. You know, this is the kind of game against a quarterback like Hartman with the older Ryan Day Ohio State defense. Notre Dame could turn this into a 1st to 40 wins. And maybe they still do, but I don't know that that's the style this game takes Saturday. Ohio State could reasonably go in. They could reasonably go in and say, if we can put 27 on the board, we can win this game, because they trust their defense that much. Whether it plays out that way is another kettle of fish, as Meemaw would say. But that's a couple of games we've talked about now, by the way, where I'm really interested. Like where does the total land? Where's that final score landing? Is it low to mid 20s? Is it upper 30s? Because that probably impacts who I picked to win the game.
And we've seen this go in both directions in high-powered football over the last decade. We've seen huge stakes games go just offense runaway, even against good defenses. But then I feel like recently we've come back a little bit to almost, it feels like offenses aren't putting up the numbers because of nerves and because of the pace of play. It seems like it's slowed down a little bit. Throw in the clock rules that are just melting first halves in particular away. I've noticed that, like, a lot of people are mentioning that, like, the play count isn't that much lower, but it feels like first halves teams are like, I got one possession in that quarter. Like, we're seeing that. And it's a little.
Here's the other thing with that. The other thing with that is, to me, it's so dumb to look at the sport holistically and extrapolate those numbers out holistically and say, oh, look, games are only 5 plays fewer than they used to be. This is not an overarching thing. It's a case by case thing. Any given Saturday, there's going to be a game out there where a team lost 3 possessions that they otherwise would have had because of clock. There's going to be a game where 35 plays are shaved off of it or something like that because of clock. And so I don't really care about what the holistic view, the 50,000-foot view is. You get into the weeds, there are some football games on an individual basis being heavily impacted by that clock.
You can't have it both ways either. If you're saying, oh, look, it's no big deal, it's only shaving 5 plays off, well, then instituting these rules under the guise of player safety isn't serving its end, so you need to get rid of it.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so you bailed me out of a little bit of a ramble there, so I appreciate that. I'm curious, we haven't talked about Notre Dame's defense. In this game, we both think Ohio State's defense is much improved. In this game, do you feel like Notre Dame's defense isn't as burdened because of where maybe the comfort level is Ohio State? Like, they don't have to be as good and as on point as Ohio State's defense, and they've got a little more breathing room?
Yes, but also the challenge. Let me tell you what coaches say. So coaches look at the Ohio State receiving corps, and they look at all these accolades they get, and they don't think as highly of the Ohio State receiving corps as the public does. And what they'll say is, watch them and how much separation they cause. Like, a lot of coaching staffs look and say, those are great athletes and they'll win contested balls sometimes, but if they were really that elite, they'd just be separating in the secondary. Now, I don't sit here and watch all 22 on Ohio State, so that could be anecdotal or it could be dead on the money accurate, but I know this will be the best defense they've played so far this year, or at least I believe it is. So that's what I'll watch. Number one, the points you just made. Does Sam Hartman alleviate the burden a little bit? Does he alleviate, the Iowa style vibe that defense sometimes used to have? Hey, we gotta hold them to 13 or less, or we've screwed ourselves. But number two, how much room is there to operate? How many open balls are there to be thrown against that secondary? Because this is the wide receiver core that should be able to do it if it's there to be had.
How much different is this spread and this 3-point spread and your outlook on this game? And I'm not talking about going into it. I'm talking about like the actual result. How much different is it because they're playing it in week 4 versus if they opened the season with this game?
Oh man. I don't know if it's probably a little bit tighter because I don't know that I would have known to expect this level of play from Notre Dame. That they've probably leveled up. Whereas I was fairly high on Ohio State, but see, at the same time, I put Ohio State as a participant in my national title game, but I said I thought they'd look awful the first month of the season. I just think their top end potential is there, and I'm rolling the dice on them. So I don't know, man. The net result would be maybe I would have expected the same thing because I expected them to look bad against Indiana. So I wouldn't have expected much more against Notre Dame. I'm almost in a way glad that we got into week 4 because as much as we love to build those out of conference week 1s up and look forward to them, sometimes it's discombobulated and it's a mess. And you almost wish you could have waited a few weeks and you could have seen them play Mercer and then Miami of Ohio. And let me get some practice under my belt before I really play the marquee game. So I'm actually glad this game's situated where it is.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I feel like just on scheduling, Notre Dame got hurt both times. Last year, I think it was week 1, week 2. So you had a quarterback from Notre Dame that really could have used a few weeks of
Yeah.
getting comfortable as a starter. And this year, Notre Dame would have loved to play Ohio State in week 1 with that version of the offense and Kyle McCord. So it's interesting. But also, you talk about week 4, and we've seen this with LSU, Florida State, Alabama, Texas. I've gone on this rant a couple of times, and I really hope that the loser of this game is not written off the way I feel like LSU has been, the way I feel
Oh,
like
yeah.
Alabama has been. Now, Alabama didn't do themselves any favors Saturday, but to me, we collectively should be celebrating these games and not making them overly punitive because people are just going to stop playing them. People are going to do what Michigan did. And has anybody watched Michigan football this year that's not a Michigan fan? There's no stakes there. There's absolutely no stakes for Michigan. And they get back on track next year. And I just use them because they're an easy example. There's a lot of teams that do this. And I'm so scared with playoff expansion and everything else. We're just going to move into clean record land and pray that we can back in with an 11-1 record and not put any strain on what we do out of conference. And it's just going to be boring. And so people need to be celebrating these games. And I don't care if the loser loses by 3 touchdowns. They don't need to be written off because it's easy to sit back and say, oh, well, LSU lost to Florida State in the opener. They're trash and they lost by 3 touchdowns or whatever. But like, who was your team playing in week 1? Right? So what I want to see coming out of this is because I feel like these are both top 5 teams. Like I know your power rankings, but take your power rating hat off and just tell us like ranking. Do you feel like these are 2 top 5 teams?
Certainly. Yeah. I would never rank the same way I power rate. I would have I'd have Washington as a top 5 team as well. I don't quite think I would power rate them top 5. So yes. And also here's the other point. I don't know if I agree with you on the surface of in the future we'll have clean record land because I actually think that people in charge of making those schedules have felt the pinch of what the in-home experience does to cut into your gate receipts. I do think that expanded playoff will have the inverse effect. It'll open them up to be willing to take more scheduling risk. And I guess I hope I'm right about that. But also the other thing is what's always infuriated me about the discourse in our sport is you've got a very, very casual minded person out there who'll beat his fist on the table and he'll demand that these teams schedule big out of conference games. He'll demand that LSU plays FSU. He'll demand that Florida goes to Utah. And then the second they lose, he'll say, they're trash. They're out of here. Get them out of my playoff picture. You are what your record says you are, which is just a complete and utter lie. Always has been in college football. And so that's the person that I wish I could get to make their mind up, because that's the same person who would, I'm talking, toss you in a furnace right now if you dared to put Michigan outside the top five. Right. Because how could you do that?
Right.
My preview magazine over here said they're number 2 and they haven't lost a game. So how could you do that? Well, I could do it because I think I saw their slot receiver take a nap on second down last week and they still moved the ball 11 yards. Like, it's been abysmal.
Yeah, I think that's also this, I asked a question on Twitter the other day about where would you rank Washington, and someone's, well, I got Georgia number 1, and I'm like, why? Because they're like, well, they're back-to-back national champions. They deserve that respect. I'm like, so you're putting more weight on what they did with a different offensive coordinator and a different quarterback last year than the results you've seen this year. Because if you take, I still think Georgia's a great team, but if you take that logo off and that memory of who they were off, they're not the number 1 team in the country. North Carolina destroyed South Carolina. Like, it was worse than the score, right? And Georgia was down. Like, they didn't play football for a half. They haven't looked great against the other weaker teams. Now, Georgia will get their act together, but they've got issues at quarterback. They've got things that, if they didn't have that logo, would not be ranked where they were. Alabama, in my opinion, like, shouldn't Texas drop a little bit from number 3 or whatever, where they're power ranked or ranked? Because if we take the information that Alabama may not be Alabama, then, maybe week to week that stuff matters more than what we had in as you say, PMS, which is preview magazine syndrome.
Yes, very important to explain that.
All right, so let's. I'm going to pick this one too. I'm going against Vegas, and every time I pick Ohio State to lose, they win. Every time I pick Notre Dame to win, they lose.
That's me with Utah. That's the conundrum I always have with Utah. I've never been right a single
Notre
time.
Dame fans do not like us, but it's like we're gun shy picking them to win, and then they lose. So I'm going Notre Dame, 31-27, covering Ohio State's 3. So tell me what you think about that.
Model has Ohio State by 4. Or no. Model has Ohio State by 6. It's just a talent differential. That's all that is, because there's certainly nothing we've seen on the field that would warrant that this year. I don't know where I'm going with this one yet. I'll tell you, yesterday when I initially started looking at it, I leaned Ohio State, because my default mechanism is when you've been a little herky-jerky, but then you've got your first premier game, it's normally what you've been building towards. And so everything you've done in the first few games has been working to get to that. And therefore you see a more well-tuned, put together version of your team in the premier game. And if you're more talented, you win the game, you make a statement, blah, blah, blah. And while 8 times out of 10, that's true, sometimes you actually go play a team that's also been doing that. But because the brand hasn't been as premier as the other brand over the past 10 years, you take them for granted. And not that Notre Dame's been a poverty brand, but Ohio State's, been right there every year. And so I don't know where I'm leaning. If you asked me this moment, and you just did, I'm slightly feeling Notre Dame. I'm slightly with you there. But that could change so quickly tomorrow when I actually have to do this on my own show.
It's tougher when you got to go on record. All those people that like to point out when we're wrong love to tell us when we're wrong, but they don't ever show us receipts that they picked it right. So
yeah, isn't it crazy the hit rate they have when you get to comment on the game after it's over?
Right.
It's crazy how well you see
they're
things.
almost always right. The other one that I always joke about is like, we hear how our model's trash because it's not perfect, and I'm like,
yes,
bro, if our model was as good as you expect it to be, you'd never know that it exists. Like,
we had one the other day. It was like, it wasn't this, but let's just say it's Texas State versus Nevada, and we predicted 33-17, and instead it's 40-14, and some dude's talking trash saying you weren't even within a touchdown of this final score. What are you talking about? And I'm like the suicide Care Bear. I just hop in front of the truck. That's it. That's all for me. I'm out of here.